Good afternoon and welcome to Election Day in the Netherlands, co-hosted by the American Enterprise Institute and the Netherland-America Foundation. My name is Stan Voiger today, and I'll be moderating today's web event. We'll discuss and analyze the elections to the Dutch Parliament, the second chamber of the States General. In-person voting started on Monday and will conclude about half an hour from now. Shortly after the polls close, the results will start trickling in. We will receive exit poll results as well, which we will have a chance to talk about. Other than that, the plan for today is as follows. We are about to hear from the ambassador of the Netherlands to the United States, André Haspels, who will provide context for today's elections. After that, we will turn to a panel discussion featuring Sean Crowley, who is the director of the Office of Western European Affairs at the United States Department of State and formerly chargé d'affaires in The Hague. We will also hear from Catharine de Vries, who is a Dutch professor of political science and the Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at Bocconi University in Milan, as well as Matt Steinglass, who is an Amsterdam-based Europe correspondent for The Economist. Throughout, please submit your questions to Philip Hoxie at aei.org or on Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. This information is on the event page as well. And now, without further ado, let me introduce Ambassador Haspels. He has been the Dutch ambassador to the United States since 2019. He previously served as ambassador in Vietnam and South Africa, and most recently, prior to coming to the US, as Director General of Political Affairs in The Hague. Ambassador Haspels, thank you so much for speaking to us today, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Stan, and welcome everybody. Yes, as you said, it is election day today in the Netherlands, or almost election night. One more hour to go before the offices close, and soon thereafter we'll have an exit poll. Let me say a few things for the opening of this event. First of all, and that may sound like an open door, but elections are a crucial part of democracies. And being a democracy is not a given. The Freedom House report that was published 1 or 2 weeks ago actually gave a very dark picture of the state of democracy in the world. That's partly because of COVID. Some of the regimes have used COVID to further curtail restrictions, to further impose measures on minorities or on populations. So in that respect, the pandemic has been abused by certain rulers. But we also see more and more in democracies and in non-democracies that institutions are under threat, whether it's about the press, whether it's about the judicial. Also in the Netherlands, you'll see, for instance, that the NOS has been threatened. And those institutions, a free press, an independent judicial court, working institutions are very crucial for a democracy. So we should be aware of that democracy can be under threat also in a democracy like the Netherlands, and we should fight for that democracy in a way like we do now, for instance, by organizing debates, by talking to each other. I think that is crucial. Secondly, as most of you will know, in the Netherlands, we always have, as the outcome of an election, we have a coalition government. At least 2 parties, but probably more, that form the majority in parliament. So that's at least 76 seats. I often have to explain as an ambassador what the advantage and the disadvantage of that model is. And I would say it has both advantages and disadvantages. The polder model, as we call it, and finding common ground. I think the big advantage is that you work together in a coalition, and that you try to find as much common ground for every participant in that coalition, but also those who are in the opposition as possible. So you also look to the interest of minorities. Within a democracy, I think that is crucial. So that is good. You try to create support for your policy. The disadvantage is, of course, that it might take a long time, and also that in the end, nobody has 100% of his objective achieved. Always you have to compromise, and there will be, everybody will be partially happy and never 100% happy, but hopefully never will be 100% unhappy in a coalition as well. And in the end, for me, I think that is in our democratic model that we have very important. And then finally, maybe, and that's my last remark on democracy, Um, it is not a given, as I said. So we have to continue working on that, not only today on the 17th of March, but also for the coming 4 years. That's a normal term of a cabinet. We have to invest in the dialogue, in reaching out to and talking to each other, in allowing people to speak out and giving the opportunity to citizens, the opportunity to raise their voice and to say what they want. So democracy is not only the 17th of March and election day, democracy continues actually for the rest of our life. So thank you very much, Stan, for giving me the opportunity to open this panel, and I'm very much looking forward to the contribution of the panelists.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And with that, we are now going to transition into panel mode. Let's see if we can make this happen technologically. There I see Catherine, Sean, and Matt. I think this, as far as I can tell from my position, this has gone flawlessly in terms of technology. Now we've heard from the ambassador. I think it's a good idea to turn to the United States State Department to hear the view the U.S. government has of the state of U.S.-Dutch relations, and any comments or commentary that you'd like to deliver on today's Dutch elections. Sean, you please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Stan. I'd also like to thank the American Enterprise Institute and the Netherlands-America Foundation for the opportunity to bring a little bit of an outside perspective to the others that are more expert perhaps on the Dutch political system. I'm also looking forward to the comments later from Dr. De Vries and from Matt Steinglass. As Stan already mentioned, I was the chargé during the last elections in the Netherlands. And so, of course, some elections have things in common and things are not in common. One of the things that we can get to later, I think, which is one of the biggest differences between the Netherlands and the United States, is the government formation period. As the ambassador already mentioned, the Dutch always have a coalition government, which is, of course, much different than we have here in the United States. But what surprised us last time was with the increasing number of parties in parliament, the amount of time that took for a new government to take place. And so the old government remains sort of in caretaker status, which they've actually been in for a little while now after the scandal that happened right before the election. But that's something that's interesting for us to see how long that's going to take, because it's difficult for any country to make big decisions until you have your government really in place. And we see that with our system as well, in between the time in elections in November and when the new administration takes over, and usually for the first couple months of the new administration as well. We know that the Dutch elections are mainly about domestic policies, including responses to the pandemic and economic measures. But despite this, they are still of interest to the United States. The government that will be formed is of interest to us because the Netherlands remains a close security and economic partner to the United States, and the Dutch share many of the same values that we have. The elections matter for us even more this time because President Biden is committed to reinvigorating and modernizing our alliances and partnerships around the world. The Dutch, I think, are a natural ally in this effort. What this means is that what the Dutch electorate feels about security, how they feel about climate change, how they feel about human rights and trade matters to the United States as well. We recognize that the biggest challenges today, and those include the pandemic and climate, can only be solved really in a multilateral effort. We have an interest in extending and continuing our cooperation with the Dutch on several areas, and that'll also be decided by what happens in the election. One, for example, is cooperation on countering the pandemic. We've both cooperated on Janssen's COVID-19 vaccine, which is produced in the Netherlands. We have a common interest in getting accountability and pursuing justice for the innocent lives that were lost on MH17, and that's an effort that the Dutch, for understandable reasons, are leading. We have an interest in our economic ties because the Dutch direct investment in the United States is responsible for about 800,000 US jobs, and US companies in the Netherlands are responsible for about 250,000 Dutch jobs, and they produce about about 5% of Dutch GDP each year, which is a very significant amount. We also have an interest in in extending and continuing our security relationship, which has been vital to maintaining peace and security both in Western Europe and in the United States. And last but not least, we have an interest in working with the Dutch in a broader European context, whether that be, for example, in PESCO defense projects where the Dutch are a leader, or in wider trade issues. So I'll leave my introductory remarks about that and turn it over to back to you, Stan.
Thank you, Sean. And there's a number of issues there that we'll come back to in a bit. But I first want to turn to Catherine, who will pick up on some of the things you mentioned, in particular the heavily domestic focus of the current Dutch elections. I've asked Catherine to talk about the European dimension of the election, such as it is. So Catherine, please go ahead. And I know you have slides, so I think we can try to get those to appear magically, which someone on the other end of the machine will make happen. Well, there we go. Oh yeah,
perfect.
Very good. So there you go, Catherine. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stan. Actually, I'm really delighted to be here. I think last time we met, Stan was in DC. I'm very sorry that we can't travel at the moment, but thank you very much for having me tonight, and also the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this. And actually, Sean Crowley kind of ended on or started talking about an issue that I'm going to talk about, which is the fact that in Dutch politics, all politics seems to be local politics. It seems to be very much focused on the domestic arena. And I would like to kind of broaden our horizon to think a little bit about from that perspective, and especially the European perspective, because this is the first election after that Brexit really happened, for example, right? So the UK leaving the EU. So in that way, it's significant also to think about how the EU plays a role in that. So maybe on the next slide. See if that magically happens.
Next slide. Oh.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So in that way, it's kind of odd if you think about it, right? So if you think about the Dutch revenue model, there's a lot of trade with the US, as we've talked about already, but, the main kind of market for EU export, for Dutch exports, but also for, engagement, economic engagement, and the kind of revenue model for the Netherlands is the EU. So it's not only does it export about 70% of its products on the single market, but also all the Dutch regions, and in particularly Northern Holland, so that's the province around Amsterdam, is really one of the biggest or is the area that gains the most from the single market, and it's about 1,800 per head per annum. So it's quite considerable, the money that's made on that kind of single market within the EU. And we've talked a lot about kind of in the election about how to spend money, but we're not talking a lot about how money is made. So this EU aspect and how we're going to think about this market and coming out of COVID has not been part and parcel of the debate. Interestingly, also the EU after kind of Brexit, and I mentioned it already, it really is a country that's now moved up to the middle country rank, or being probably the most important of the countries that are not the biggest countries in the EU. So like Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and Poland. And the Netherlands really has been pushing above its weight politically and economically within this market. However, its position within the EU is not uncontroversial. So this is a picture of two previous finance ministers, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who was also head of the Eurogroup, and Wopke Hoekstra. And I don't know if it's made the news in the US because we were all busy with the pandemic, but as the Europeans were negotiating the response, the fiscal response to the pandemic and the next generation EU, so the big fiscal package that was that the Commission decided on, Wopke Hoekstra was not particularly diplomatic when it came to southern member states. So as the pandemic was really hitting Italy quite strongly, and one saw the images of people dying, of hospitals being overwhelmed, there was a lot of focus on, debt, on fiscal space, and on why Italy was not up to deal with this economically. And that really has strained some of these relationships earlier on. Ultimately, of course, the Dutch decided to agree on the recovery fund, and it's been pushed through, but it's never been an easy relationship. And I want to go to the next slide to kind of outline why that's the case. And I think a lot of the time, what Dutch politicians do within the EU also serves a domestic purpose. And especially as these elections were looming, the Netherlands had the election coming the closest to the pandemic. One sees a kind of half-hearted response also at the side of public opinion. So you see divisions within political parties about how to deal with the EU and how much to do jointly within the EU. But overall, even public opinion in the Netherlands, even though it's very clear that there's a lot of benefit from that single market, as I just talked about, but that maybe the Dutch could be classified as reluctant Remainers. So this is some survey data on if people would like to see more or less political and economic integration in Europe. I do this together with the Bertelsmann Foundation, a German foundation. The opinion poll is called EU Opinions. And here we see the Dutch really on the low end of, in the kind of low end of these country groupings, well below the EU average when it comes to wanting to see more integration. If we, however, and maybe if you just, if it gets pressed again, hopefully another graph comes. Oh, it's already, sorry, no, could you just go back? So I think maybe it didn't come up. Anyway, so if we would, doesn't matter. If we would do the same picture, if we ask people if there would be a referendum called on EU membership in the Netherlands today, then this picture flips. And actually a lot of Dutch people support remaining within the EU. So the picture you get is, yes, we want to remain, but we want things to stay the same and not go further. Hence these kind of reluctant Remainers, to use the language from the kind of Brexit campaign. And a lot of politicians, I think, are also trying to move towards that and play towards that domestic public when they are negotiating at the EU level as well. So that might explain some of that kind of two sides that you see sometimes in Dutch diplomacy at the EU level. The next slide. So then coming to this particular election, and as Sean already alluded to, it was quite a domestic campaign, a lot of international dimension to it, and so not what you see in kind of US elections or maybe UK elections, where also relationships to China, relationships to the US, or relationships to the EU are discussed. No, not at all. However, this time around, there was a little bit of a disruption coming from the Twitter space or from the opinion pages, where a lot of experts have said, well, finally, we need to start talking about what the Dutch want from the EU in the future. So, the Dutch have been able to hide themselves either behind the Germans or behind the UK, especially when it was more Eurosceptic. The UK has left the EU, so now the Dutch will have to kind of constructively start shaping their vision on the EU and have to play ball with the other countries. So maybe we should discuss this. So it started a bit as a joke on Twitter. You see here in the upper hand, you see a picture of Mark Rutte with the picture of the Dutch parliament behind him. And actually he did not have an EU flag, and some pundits had noted that he was the only one on the Zoom call that didn't have an EU flag, and someone put a little elephant and an EU flag in the picture, in the idea of, the EU is the elephant in the room, and it's discussed. This became a hashtag, EU elephant, or EU olifant in Dutch. And interestingly, what we saw for the first time is that there was some EU discussion in the last debate, actually yesterday. And also we see the development of, we've seen a lot of political entrepreneurs on the Dutch electoral system, more on the extreme right, or on the populist right. Think of Geert Wilders, think also of Thierry Baudet, which is the leader of Forum for Democracy, a new populist right party. Also Ja21, which is a subgroup of that party. It's difficult to follow sometimes. So a lot of kind of disruption on the right end of the party system. And now what we're seeing is also on the progressive end of the party system. So that's almost the kind of countervailing of that image with a transnational list called Volt. So that's a party that actually is a party of many young people in many different EU countries, and they're operating now and might get seats for the first time in a national parliament. They're projected to have 3 seats in Dutch parliament, but it's also made other political parties, for example, like D66, Democrat 66, which is a kind of pro-EU party, but more explicitly pro-EU in this campaign. And then Geert Wilders, who is maybe one of the only last Mohicans together with Thierry Baudet for Nexit. A lot of that element, I think, has kind of left the Dutch debate. But nonetheless, we saw a little bit more polarization on the EU end. And I think what will be interesting to see, and I am still a bit, we'll see the exit polls. I'm still a bit worried that the polling has been a bit off because it's such a weird situation with COVID. But you know, we might see that. But nonetheless, that we'll see for the first time a explicitly pro-EU, pro-federal party entering Dutch parliament, and also maybe even D66, which is a very pro-EU and very committed pro-EU party, maybe ending up even as a second party behind the Liberal Party of Mark Rutte. And it'll be very interesting to see how that will then change. Will that lead into a more constructive, cooperative relationship of the Dutch in the EU? I think it's very important that the Dutch are shaping a discussion about, we have rules, we have to commit to those rules. That's perfect. But sometimes the diplomacy around it has not always been so constructive. So that will be very interesting to watch. So those are some of the comments I had about the kind of EU dimension in Dutch politics, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, Catherine, can I ask you one quick clarifying question before I turn to Matt? So the poll numbers you showed in your previous slide, about 40% of the Dutch population wants further EU integration. That, of course, does not mean that the other 60% supports departure from the European Union, just to clarify for the viewers.
No, exactly. So these are really about more political and economic integration. And the other end, which is about also roughly 40% want less, and 20% want everything to stay the same. So there is a considerable amount of people, to be fair, that have the feeling that, the status quo might have gone too far, but it's more about stagnation, i.e. wanting to remain where it is currently, than moving forward. But if you then would flip it to wanting to remain within the EU, you get about 70 to 80% of Dutch people wanting to remain. So just to make that very clear.
Exactly, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Then, Matt, I've asked you, and you're going to talk about arguably the actual elephant in the room during these elections, which is the COVID crisis, of course. And so, Matt, please go ahead. I believe your slides are queued up, and we should be.
Great. They're probably queued up in a random order because I didn't have the foresight to put them actually into a.
Well, we'll see what pops out first.
Okay, we'll go forward and backward until we find the right one. But so I wanted. What do you know? Actually, could we, as the first one, I would want to see the COVID cases, NL COVID cases. If we've got that. Yes, that's good. Perfect. I think elephant in the room. It is actually a good categorization of the role that COVID has been playing in this election, because the strange thing is it's absolutely the dominant issue, of course, naturally, as you expect it to be. But it's not that it's absent from debate, but it's not brought into debate in the normal way that one would expect in a political sphere where people criticize what the government has done and so forth. It's been kind of a strange gaping hole. And to explore why that is, I thought I'd take a quick little detour. First of all, as an outsider living in the Netherlands, and I've been in the Netherlands for on and off for the last 10 years, particularly as an American, one of the things that really strikes you about the country is that systems run extremely well. Infrastructure systems are built well. They're integrated well. The health system runs well. It's well planned out. Long-term planning projects that are looked at 10, 20 years in advance are meticulously worked out. Things intersect well with each other. So as an American living in the Netherlands, when the COVID crisis hit last March, I expected that it would be handled with aplomb, calmness, that the results that you would see would be superior to surrounding countries. And I think this has been an experience that a lot of Americans and British living in the Netherlands have had. That did not turn out to be the case. If you look at the COVID cases per million people if you compare the Netherlands to peer countries like Germany and Denmark, the Netherlands did worse. And it was disappointing both to see that. Well, so it appeared clear from an outside perspective that the Netherlands was doing worse, but Dutch people didn't seem to think that the Netherlands was doing worse. There wasn't a public outcry about inferior performance relative to Germany in particular, which is very striking because particularly in that first wave, the Germans were wildly outperforming the Netherlands in terms of implementing social distancing measures, keeping the numbers down. I think you've been seeing an echo of that in this campaign. Part of the reason why it hasn't been raised as a political issue is that people in the Netherlands aren't furious about it. To substantiate the case, the cases were worse in the Netherlands. If we can go to the NL COVID vaccination rate, that's also, the Netherlands started very late. There was a sort of an inexplicable delay where, first of all, the European Medicines Agency didn't approve vaccines until the end of December, whereas they had already been approved in the United States and the UK earlier. That's okay. It's an agency that makes its own priorities. It's regrettable, but after those vaccines were approved, if you can see where the Netherlands kicks off, it's the green line at the bottom. It didn't actually start vaccinating for several weeks after the Europeans had approved the vaccines, and various explanations for this were offered by the health ministry, which were not terribly convincing. They've never caught up to other European countries. And then if you wanted to explain why this hasn't caused outrage in the Netherlands, what explanation might be that excess mortality slide, if I could have the excess mortality slide, which I think was the first one. On excess mortality, the Netherlands has for reasons that I haven't seen explained, they haven't had tremendous excess mortality compared to other countries. That's particularly hard to explain because they don't have enough intensive care units in the Netherlands. A lot of the drama in spring revolved around the comparison between the Dutch health system and the German health system on the number of intensive care beds. Germany has a tremendous number of sort of excess emergency intensive care beds available. The Netherlands was at capacity very quickly and had to scale up on an emergency basis. But in any case, the excess mortality in the Netherlands hasn't been so high. So that may be a reason why there's not so much anxiety. But also, if you look at that NL containment index slide, what you saw through the course of the year was that the Dutch system was repeatedly, could we get that NL containment one, which is the map of Europe? The Dutch system, Dutch authorities were repeatedly reacting. It felt as though there was a repeated late reaction to developments in the COVID epidemic. You would see numbers mounting, but curfews were not being implemented. The question of curfews would arise in Parliament. People were anxious about even touching that. There was, people were very reluctant to implement French-style measures. This is at a moment in November when the Netherlands was experiencing a crest of cases, and you can see that the level of containment measures that the Dutch were implementing was lower than that in surrounding countries and much lower than in places like France. So in any case, that takes care of the situation that actually existed. Getting onto the political debate, parties have been very reluctant to criticize the government over COVID. And it's the analysis that I've heard, although I haven't heard this from political practitioners, is that if you are the party that it's one of those murder-suicide situations like you have in American debates, where if you are the party that raises this issue first, you will suffer. And ultimately, the opposition may benefit because the issue will be advanced, but you don't want to be the first one to step out there. So no one has been the first one to step out there. And you saw this like even in the debate on Tuesday night. Well, that was a slightly different issue, but in the first major debate between parliamentarians, the only parties that have been willing to criticize the government substantially are the populist right parties. So Geert Wilders' PVV, savages the government for cutting healthcare benefits because the PVV is actually quite left-wing on some social issues and on defending health spending. So that's a comfortable terrain for them to attack the government. When Geert Wilders put forward that view in the first major debate between party leaders, the leader of the Green Left Party, Jesse Klaver, immediately attacked him for sowing division. This was a national priority. We have to stick together. That is very striking. Green Left is a party that's in the opposition. It's out of the government. It's not doing well in the polls. So you would think that it had a strong interest in getting some vicious debate about the government's underperformance on COVID going, but that turned out not to be the case. It's never really gotten underway. And I think, so there are two things that I wanted to raise in that context. One was to connect with what Catherine was talking about the Dutch attitude towards Europe. So Mathieu Segers, who's a professor in Maastricht, I believe, wrote a really nice piece a couple of weeks ago about Dutch complacency. And his sense was there's a risk that the Netherlands is becoming a country that thinks it already knows everything. That the Dutch assumed that their response to COVID must be better than that of neighboring countries, even when it wasn't. That this is similar to the way that the Dutch believe that their economic policies are better than other European countries, that they assumed at the beginning of the COVID epidemic that things were going wrong in Italy because everything always goes wrong in Italy, and that this undermines European solidarity ultimately, because the Dutch compare themselves to other European countries and feel superior. And that's part of the reason why they're so anxious about further European integration. I thought that was a really interesting analysis. And I think that's part of a more general phenomenon about the way that the Dutch think about Europe. And that returned in the final debate that I saw on Tuesday night in a confrontation. So Sigrid Kaag, the leader of the D66 party, I hope that people have enough background to understand what I'm talking about here, but D66 is a very socially progressive party that's kind of economically centrist. Sigrid Kaag has been doing, in some ways, surprisingly well, very impressively in the course of the campaign. D66's numbers have been rising right at the end.
She's the current international trade minister.
Yes, current international trade minister, that's right. And she, as part of the final debate, she picked as her debate opponent for one segment of it, the leader of the Socialist Party, which is the farthest left-wing party in the Netherlands, basically on economic grounds anyway. And the leader of the Socialist Party, Lilian Marijnissen, criticized Kaag for being unwilling to go ahead with the digital services tax because it hadn't been passed at a European level. And the criticism was, Kaag's point is, this is something that has to be implemented at a European level because it won't work if you implement it as one individual country. Fair enough. Marijnissen's point was, it's not being implemented at a European level, and we want to go ahead at a national level and see if we can get some momentum behind this. And her critique felt substantive to me, that there is a kind of paralysis that results on European issues in the Netherlands because people who advocate for European action aren't actually willing to follow up on it when it comes down to a national level. So I think that's where I wanted to leave it. I hope that's brought things back around to the European question in an interesting way. And I wish there'd been more debate over COVID in the Netherlands, and we'll see if it comes up now that after the elections are over.
This is good. So just so our audience knows, the exit poll results were just announced. So we are going to place those in a slide that we will show shortly, but I will give everyone a quick preview. The VVD, which is currently the largest party, the party of the Prime Minister, is expected to secure 35 seats, which is 3 more than it currently has in Parliament. D66, which is led by Sigrid Kaag, the international trade minister you just mentioned, has apparently secured 27 seats, which would be a surprisingly large increase in its number of seats. It's currently at 19, and it was polling at around 19. So that would be a major victory for her and for sort of that pro-EU brand that Catherine just talked about. and we're seeing losses for the Christian Democrats and Wilders's PVV. So a bit of a shift to the center left. I think we can talk about that. We can talk about this a little more when we have the results on the slide. But let me first go back to Sean, because now that we've talked about COVID for a little bit, I wanted to ask if you could speak to how the US sees cooperating with Europe and the Netherlands in the COVID sphere going forward, which will obviously be important both for domestic European and American purposes, but also in the developing world, where I think some of the concerns lie. I think we've heard some of Matt's concerns. I think there are currently problems with the vaccination rollout throughout Europe, certainly outside the UK. And so how do you see that going? What are US priorities in the cooperation process with Europe? And what is the vision the Biden administration has for the vaccination effort, especially once the US is done, which hopefully will be in the next few months? Sean, can you talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. First, there's been a course of change in the United States in the last few months. The new administration has a different tact at how they're approaching the international cooperation on COVID than the previous administration had. And you see that with COVAX and the American participation now and the contributions and working towards the international effort. But what was common between the past administration and the current administration is the US perspective of looking at ways that we could also foster private sector cooperation. And I think you saw that specifically with the Dutch, who have, for several of the US medical companies, they have large R&D operations in the Netherlands, and the reverse is true. And several of the large European Dutch companies have R&D cooperation here. And there was some joint funding of vaccines that went along. And I think that proved to be very successful when we eventually get out of the crisis mode that we're all in right now, and we look at what worked and what didn't work. I think some of the initial things that we did with the Netherlands will be seen as best practices that we could use again in the future. On the actual vaccinations, of course, things are going fairly well in the United States in comparison to many other countries, including many of the European countries. The pace has picked up. Of course, we only have to deal with our one big bureaucracy here, and we don't have to deal with the European bureaucracy and then each member state bureaucracy. So I think it's a little bit comparing apples and oranges in that regard. But I do want to make one comment to follow up just real quickly on what Matt said about the Dutch reaction to COVID. And I think they just announced, in addition to that the polls are closing, that the curfew is not going to be enforced today because of voting. And that's a typical Dutch way of approaching problems, which is a very practical way to deal with things. And it doesn't matter if that's COVID or it's trade or it's security. I think that's one of the Dutch traits that you see. Sometimes to a humorous extent, we had the last US election party. Whenever we have American elections, we do a event like this. And usually last time we could do it all 4 years ago, we did it live. And we had cardboard cutouts of Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump at the opening of our Dutch event in Scheveningen, which I still can't pronounce. And as the people came in, it was really great to see.
I thought that was pretty good, actually. Scheveningen, I think.
Well, I tried.
Yeah, but, don't cut yourself short. No.
Every Dutch person when we came in took a picture with the cutout of Secretary Clinton, and a very, very small number of Dutch people took a picture with the cutout of Donald Trump as they came in. But as we all went through the evening and we saw the American election results, and it was apparent that Donald Trump was going to be the next president at that time, on the way out of the building, almost every person stopped and took their picture with the Donald Trump cutout. So the Dutch are very practical, if nothing else.
Thank you very much. Catherine, would you want to talk about the European dimension of the vaccine rollout a little bit? Maybe also, I know you've written a book about challenger parties. It looks like some of the Dutch challenger parties have done reasonably well. The Forum for Democracy appears to have gone from 2 to 7 seats, despite a As you mentioned earlier, a section, I guess the anti-Semitic section of the party seceding earlier this year, and its Senate faction really falling into deep division. It looks like they're up from 2 to 7, which is below where they were 2 years ago during the Senate elections, but up from their parliamentary representation 4 years ago. Geert Wilders appears to have lost a little bit. I guess those two parties are exchanging voters. And then we have a number of new parties. So as you mentioned, Volt appears to have, at least based on the exit poll results, secured 4 seats. Bijeen, or Together, which is an anti-racism party, really quite explicitly appears to have secured a vote. We have a seat. We have a seat for a farmers' party. You know, lots of new parties. Do you want to talk about both of those dimensions? Why are things seemingly so? Why is the vaccine rollout going so poorly at the European level? What's happening there? And then how should we think about all these new parties and what are they trying to accomplish? Why are we seeing so much of that? Please go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So I think actually following up on what Sean Crowley was just saying in terms of the bureaucracy, this is actually, in terms of vaccines, I think the von der Leyen, so the Commission president, decided that, well, because health is not an authority of the Commission, right? So that's actually something that's done at the national level, a member state. In EU speak, a member state competence, so something that is authority at the EU, not at the EU level, but at the national level. That there was not so much that the Commission could do. But of course, procuring, that it could do on the vaccines. But this was the first time that the European Commission put any procurement deal out for the entire EU. And that was clear. They've just made some mistakes. And they've made some mistakes, especially on thinking about cost and not thinking about delivery, right? And that was clear in some of the changes, the differences in wording between certain contracts that the UK had put forward vis-a-vis the Commission. And that's always the issue, that sometimes you have a lot of competence on trade that's only in Brussels now, because that's what the EU does. And then, you know, competence on these particular health elements is much less present at the EU level. So I think that's one part of it. So it's an institutional element. A second element is also, I think, more personal, and that has to do with von der Leyen. And she was a minister in Germany, and she's had several procurement scandals in Germany. And the reason is that she seems to work with this very small group of trusted advisors, and then shuts a lot of people out. And that's, of course, at a certain point, you get a bit of groupthink, and that might not necessarily be most constructive. You see that also in her, what I think is unfortunate lack of apology for what had happened. Just to, you know, acknowledge, it would be maybe shown the kind of Dutch pragmatic way, you know, like just acknowledge that that's there and then move on, right? Rather than trying to feed that. So I think these two elements, the institutional and the kind of personal, are important for the rollout. But then there are also issues at the national level, of course. Then what you were asking me about the challenger parties, well, I think what's the most important thing to remember is that the Dutch electoral system is the most proportional in the world. So it has one district, right? The entire country is one district. It's also not very large, to be fair. But then there's no hurdle. So if you get about 0.7% of the votes, you get a seat. So it's in that way, you know, it's very proportional. And then you can, you know, new parties can come into that. But I think the particularity, Stone, of these parties is that now, what I said previously, you saw a lot of disruption in the party system on immigration, actually very similar to the disruption of Donald Trump in the Republican Party. In the Netherlands, you just see it in separate parties, right? So there are different stances that then enter. And now you see a lot of the disruption on the progressive end. And that's almost as a response to kind of what's been happening for years and what's been going on. And now some people thinking, well, actually mainstream left or mainstream progressive is not responding in the way that it should. So we give them a push. Right? And we have an anti-racism party, we had a party of the animals, we have a especially pro-EU party. So I think a lot of this disruption in the party system is not on the traditional left-right, but it's really on the parochial cosmopolitan or parochial, more internationalist, let's say, stance. And this is really where it's going. And in that way, I think these challenger parties are almost an answer to what you saw previously in the last couple of elections, which was much more disruption on the populist right.
Because obviously, we've always had a system of proportional representation without a hurdle to entry, right? So you do need, a proliferation of issues or dimensions.
But we've had, of course, disruptions earlier, right? So D66 was a disruptive party in 66 on gender related. So oftentimes we see disruption in the Dutch party system on the second dimension. So not on kind of left-right politics, which is traditionally the liberals versus the social democrats, but on this element. It can either be women's rights, abortion element, and now it's very much immigration, European integration, climate that's really, disrupting the party system.
Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Sorry, Catherine, would you be as stunned as I would be if that exit poll result for D66 is correct? Because that is extraordinary.
So I do think that I'm not going to say it, but I always wanted to write a book about Dutch politics using D66 as the kind of vehicle to describe it, because D66 kind of goes up and down with certain kind of tides of consent of the public. So we see it moves more to the kind of parochial right, and then D66 goes down again. And then when there's a progressive spring, it was on democratic renewal earlier on gender, you see this element again. So I think it really does suggest that maybe some part of the Dutch electorate is fed up with a lot of this anti-immigration standpoints, similarly to what you saw as the turnout and the movement in the Democratic Party in response to Trump. And maybe also then thinking which is the vehicle to do that. And D66 has always been better to mold these differences, but it also makes it very volatile. It moves up and down quite quickly, I think, because of picking up that sentiment. But I would be surprised, Matt, if that's not what I would have predicted. No.
Yeah. So to be clear, so that the audience realizes this is, of course, an exit poll, and circumstances are a little different this year. There's voting spread out over 3 days. I think Dutch exit polls have traditionally been quite close to the final results, but I think there's a little more uncertainty this year. So take it with a grain of salt. But so here we have the results on a slide, as you see, D66 going up pretty dramatically, small gain for the VVD as well. Parties a little further on the left have done really quite poorly. The Green Left losing almost half of its seats here, and the Socialist Party as well. Of course, some of that comes from the various new parties that have popped up, but I do think it's a bit of a massacre on what you would traditionally classify as the left, as opposed to the broader center. So I want to talk about a couple of other policy issues, but feel free to start calculating feasible coalitions in your head while we do so. One of the topics that Sean mentioned in his earlier remarks, besides COVID, was trade policy, where the administration has an interest in working with the European Union, I suppose, in this case, in ways that the previous administration, may have been less inclined to do. I would sort of broadly like to hear what the agenda there looks like. I don't think people's dreams of TTIP are anywhere close to becoming reality anytime soon. But there is, of course, a number of significant, more narrow issues, and I think that Matt has a couple of questions about this as well. So, Matt, why don't you specify what you would like to hear about, and then we can go to Sean. Yeah.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with some people from the American Chamber of Commerce here a couple of weeks ago, and two subjects that were really of interest to me were the question of digital service taxes, at which a lot of European countries would like to pass, partly because they don't have any major digital service providers in their countries on the scale of Facebook and Google anyway, and the question of carbon tariffs, which some European industrial producers have become more favorable towards, since Europe has lower carbon intensity than other places, and which is also high on the agenda of a lot of European governments. So what they were saying, which I found striking, was they said both of these things they're probably things that are going to happen at some point in the future, but they really strongly prefer they happen at the European level and not at individual country levels, because then you just end up with Byzantine chaos of different rules. How does the U.S. does the U.S. feel that these are things that are eventually going to happen and that it's important to do them in a nice orderly fashion between big blocks, or does the U.S. still feel like digital service taxes are not a good idea?
Hi, thanks for those questions. I'll get to them, but I did want to just address one thing and maybe ask a question for Catherine for later on. We were talking about D66 being the big surprise here. To me, that's an even bigger surprise, because if you look historically, the coalition partner for the current prime minister has traditionally done extraordinarily poorly in the follow-on election. If you look at PVV with the semi-coalition that they had, if you look at the huge change in the Labour Party in the last election. So I think when this coalition started, one of the things that a lot of people thought was that D66, this is going to be very dangerous for them getting into this coalition with Premier Rutte. And it appears to be a surprise in that regard as well. So maybe we can come back to that later, but I'd be very interested in hearing your perspective on that.
Yeah, Sean, let me also highlight that. So as you mentioned, Labour, after it was part of that coalition, lost a tremendous share of its number of seats and ended up at a historic low in the 2017 elections. And I think the expectation now was, certainly the polls indicated at least a little bit of mean reversion there, but we're not seeing that in this exit poll. So Labour here has remained at 9 seats, which is really quite stunning. If you were to go back to any Dutch election prior to between 2017 and World War II, you would have seen very different numbers there. But anyway, please go ahead on the digital service taxes.
Okay, and I can talk a little bit more about digital service taxes than I can about the carbon tariffs. Sorry, Matt, I'm not. Secretary Kerry was just in Europe last week for the first time. With COVID, of course, travel is very difficult, and just had the initial discussions with the European Union in Brussels, and then was in Paris talking to different folks. And so I don't have a good steer on where we're going there on that question, but especially on the digital services taxes, there has been a big change, and it's not just there, but also you saw the suspension of the Airbus and Boeing tariffs that just happened recently. I think that signals a different way of trying to resolve issues. The issues are still as difficult as they were before, and they still don't have a solution to them. So it's not preordained that this is going to work out great for everybody in the end, but at least it's I think a new tactic and a new strategy on trying to talk to folks and resolve them and see if that's possible. Specifically on digital services taxes, that's been a concern for the United States, specifically because of many of the European countries have written their DST rules so that they explicitly target only certain companies above a certain amount of income, with certain national exceptions. And so I think in Italy that there was a certain amount of that happening, and in Austria where they exempted their own public broadcaster from that. And we've seen that in several places. So what Secretary Yellen has said repeatedly now is that we are committed to a multilateral solution to that, because it does not appear to be one that's going to be easy to do in a bilateral setting. And it just doesn't work. And I think the Netherlands there is maybe a good ally for the United States, not on every aspect of the policy, but because of their view of the economy and because of the importance of the digital economy to the Netherlands, and ensuring that continues in the future. So I think we both share a strong view on the importance of getting some kind of fair and just system out of the OECD negotiations that are currently going on. And there is some movement in those. There is some difference, a change in the position from the previous administration, which may make it easier on minimal tax rates and that sort of thing. But of course, that's the beginning of a discussion that is also going to take a little bit of time until we get there. So we've seen several European countries postpone. They've implemented they've passed their DST taxes, but they've postponed implementation until 2022 or 2023. to see if the OECD would be successful in getting towards a multilateral solution. And I think that's the way that the United States government is pushing for right now as well.
For viewers who are interested in what I would say is an excruciating level of background on the issue of digital service taxes, a couple of years ago, and you should be able to find this easily, I hosted then Commissioner Moscovici for an event at AEI where he laid out the Commission's view of where those things could go. That performance was followed by a panel discussion in which, among others, Itai Grinberg participated, who is now at the Treasury Department. And if you want to, see both a pitch for the importance of digital service taxes and a lot of deep fury about the idea of digital service taxes as then proposed by the Commission, that is a good event. You get those perspectives very well from Commissioner Moscovici and from Itai Grinberg. So I would recommend that. But with that, let me go back to let me give Catherine a chance to respond to Sean, who expressed his surprise at D66's performance in this exit poll, at least, despite having been a part of the coalition. What happened there, Catherine?
Exactly. So, I mean, going back to the digital service tax, the DC6 is also quite explicit about that with Marietje Schaake, who used to be an MEP and who's now at Stanford and who's a real advocate of these kind of taxes. So I think that will also influence the thinking of that party, I would think. But Sean, you're exactly right. So it's not only a Dutch phenomenon, actually overall junior partners, so of kind of political science literature very explicitly in Europe, junior partners and coalitions just don't do well, because a lot of voters will associate those things in coalitions, right? Who do you reward after a coalition government? They often reward that to the prime minister, especially when the prime minister is popular. We've seen that also with the Christian Democrats in Germany. We've seen that in many other countries as well. So I think and maybe Stan and Matt have different ideas about this, but I think that what is very clear from the campaign of Kaag, that at the beginning, when the campaign started, a lot of people thought that the Christian Democrats, who had the finance minister, usually finance ministers are super popular in the Netherlands because that's where, it's all about money making and trade. That's really important. So he was, I think, viewed as a potential real threat to Mark Rutte. I have to say, I can't say it any different. He tanked in the campaign. He did really awfully in debates. He didn't have his facts together, his figures, and that especially as a finance minister doesn't look good. And he was a consultant, but partner of McKinsey in the Netherlands. So he was just not in this debating. He was not a politician before. He was a kind of an expert coming into government. And I think you saw that in the campaign. It's not his forte. He's good at doing stuff in the ministry, but not so much in that public debate. And what you really saw with the leader of D66, that she really grew into her role, and she almost seemed, I think, as the only alternative prime minister candidate. And she portrayed herself like that, and also was explicit kind of on her progressiveness. And I think that is quite interesting in the sense that, I mean, also coming back to, I think, what I see is a bit of a difference between the Biden-Harris ticket vis-a-vis the ticket Clinton and Kane, was the sense that this progressiveness was part and parcel of that debate, much more an explicit reference to that, of course, due to Black Lives Matter, etc. But I think that was the same in the Netherlands with D66, that after a time of having had a lot of discussion on immigration, and debates that, we are very good in the Netherlands to criticize Donald Trump, but a lot of the same rhetoric is coming out of the populist right, and even of some right politicians of mainstream parties. And I think she explicitly denied that, put kind of a line down in the sand and said, I don't want to do this like this anymore. And yesterday also, so she was in a debate with Geert Wilders, so with the leader of the populist right party, Party for Freedom, and he was calling her a traitor. And then it was very clear in my group of friends, but also on Twitter, that a lot of women had the issue that, how dare he say that to a woman who's been, so internationally at the UN as our trade minister, flying around the world, representing the Netherlands in many different, how can he say that? And I think that actually, you saw that she was really angry, and you saw that she really kind of meant it. And I really had the feeling that, I don't know, I mean, I still don't believe this exit poll, but if this exit poll were the case, that you had a little bit of the feeling in the app groups, in the kind of Twitter bubbles at least, that people were like, oh, this is a sincere person who really wants to kind of, move the Netherlands out of that discussion and move it back into a more pragmatic, international, outward-looking, which is what the country has been, right? And I think we've had since Pim Fortuyn, so with the breakthrough of the populist right in the early 2000s, it's been a lot of inward-looking. And I think now, some people are a bit sick and tired of that and think, well, we really need to engage with, and especially post-Brexit, we need to engage with our European partners. We need to engage again with the Biden administration. So that's the way I would read a little bit why she was better able or better equipped, let's say, as a junior partner to do that. But I might be reading too much into the person, but I do think that played a role.
I mean, I also think there's a lot of voters to the left of the VVD, and there is no, I think, other even marginally credible alternative for the position of Prime Minister besides her, right? So I think that may have drawn some voters from the Green Left, from Labour, from the SP, maybe even from the Christian Democrats, right? People who want to ultimately influence coalition formation. I don't know, because ultimately, I think the expectation was Rutte is going to be prime minister, and so then ultimately, what you're fighting over is the balance of power within the coalition and the composition of the coalition. I do think that contrast with the PVV in particular was very, very explicit. PVV hasn't done that well, but for sure, you see some of the same dynamics that you see here in U.S. politics, obviously. Wilders, for example, on Islam has adopted even more extreme positions than Trump, to the point where he wants to close down mosques and ban the Quran. It's hard to imagine that level of exclusionary religious thought, even within the American context, even despite what we've seen over the past 5 years. So I do think, that contrast probably helped her quite significantly. One other issue before we continue to speculate about coalition formation that I wanted to touch upon briefly, also because Sean mentioned it, is environmental policy. We I don't think see in these results at least an escalating level of interest in climate change, in environmental policy, right? So there is a party for the animals in the Netherlands that in this exit poll has gone from 5 to 6 seats. And there is the Green Left, which appears to have lost almost half of its seats. Now, and maybe Matt, maybe you can talk about this. I do think it's important for our audience to understand that environmental politics in the Netherlands is a little different from the way it is in the US. I think that even the center-right parties are broadly on board with a pretty aggressive anti-climate change policy. It was one of the issues that I think led to the lengthy coalition negotiations that happened in 2017, but have since more or less been sorted out. Can you talk about that a little bit? Can you talk about the extent to which it has come to the forefront in this election? And then maybe afterwards, Sean can talk about how he sees the US administration's stance on this and what goals are in negotiation with the Netherlands and the European Union in that area.
Yeah, I mean, the shift in this campaign, it felt like a noticeable shift to me that every party across the spectrum, except for the populist right, is now on board with fairly aggressive greenhouse gas emissions commitments. You saw, I wonder if there's a political science term for this, but sometimes you get this phenomenon where everybody's stampeding over each other to get, like, there's a sense that the entire electorate has gone for something and every party is trying to differentiate itself, but all kind of in the same direction. And it felt like that was happening in a very hopefully positive way on climate policies in the Netherlands in this election. What you did see was so some of that struggle for differentiation would happen, for example, in that debate between Klaver and Hoekstra. What Klaver of the Green Left Party was trying to pin Hoekstra down on from the Christian Democrats was the sense that the Christian Democrats won't actually do anything to meet the goals that they claim to be committed to, particularly not on greenhouse gas emissions, but on nitrogen emissions, which is a huge issue in the Netherlands because there's too much farming going on in a small country and they're laying down too much excess nitrogen. So there's, I don't know, I'm not sure.
No, but Matt, I mean, I understand it. It sounds awkward to talk about this to an American audience, but it is a major issue and it affects all kinds of decision making, right? It really
it's huge, yeah.
Produces really stark choices between, do we want more housing? Do you want more agriculture? Do you want to construct? Do you want to build more infrastructure? And so it really affects a lot of more bread and butter issues are directly affected by it. Yeah.
And also because of the fascinating way that the Dutch judicial system has started to function on this, where they're actually taking interpretations of Dutch commitments under Dutch law and stating that these are legal obligations that bind the government. So if the technological means that have been implemented in order to meet the aspirational nitrogen reduction targets are not actually meeting those targets, then a court will tell the government, you must start implementing something, more stringent, or you're in violation of your own laws. So that's the way it looks to me like climate policy was playing out in this. But it also seems like an important distinction between parties that actually are willing to make some sacrifices in order to meet those commitments. And what Hoekstra's line was, you can still meet nitrogen commitments with new technology, which is something the Dutch have already tried. It didn't work, and you can see the difference between parties that will really make sacrifices on the environment versus parties that would like to include it in their platform, but aren't.
Hoekstra being the finance minister and the leader of the Christian Democrats after the health minister had to stop being their leader because things weren't going so well for him. Sean, so what are U.S. goals in the sort of broader environmental sphere, or specifically on climate policy? I don't know that nitrogen emissions are necessarily at the heart of the Biden administration's set of interests, but I know the climate policy is more so.
Well, I mean, I think Matt's hit it on the head when he said that the other parties in Parliament sort of have all adopted a lot of what would be traditionally environmental platforms from other parties. So it's hard to distinguish yourself on that regard in that front. And I think if the exit polls hold, one of the big things too is the decline of Green Left, because this time we're talking about Sigrid Kaag, and maybe she is the only other person seen as prime minister level. After the last election, that's how a lot of people were talking about Jesse Klaver. And so that's interesting to see that's gone down a little bit. And the nitrogen, and we can make jokes about the nitrogen issue, but it's deadly serious in the Netherlands, and it's very important. You look at the current polls, there's going to be a farmer party involved in the government too, and I think that's a little bit of the backlash to the nitrogen limitations, which would have a huge effect upon the Dutch landscape, Dutch culture, what people think about with all the things that attract the tourists to the Netherlands, but are traditionally important to most Dutch people. From the U.S. point of view, I think the Dutch are going to be a great partner for us, and I think we're going to be a much better partner than perhaps we have been in recent years for Dutch on climate issues. As I mentioned, Senator Kerry was just over in Europe, and one of the things that he's really pushing for is trying to push people to be even more ambitious than we have been in our goals. And of course, that's first and foremost for us involves the United States being more ambitious in our own climate goals. But as we get towards the COP26, it really does involve working with our friends and our allies to make sure that everyone increases their level of ambition on what they want to achieve on that. And I think it's important that to recognize Senator Kerry, one of the first things he did after being named Special Presidential Climate Envoy already on January 25th and 26th, is that he took part in a climate summit that was hosted by the Netherlands. So I think he's going to find a good partner and people that we can work with we'll continue to disagree on some other issues, but on climate, I think there'll be a much higher level of agreement than we have seen in the last few years.
That's right. So Catherine just pointed out that the term we were looking for is issue trespassing, and that's the political science term. So I wanted to. So the farmer party that Sean just referenced, by the way, is BBB for people who are following along. That's the Boer-Burgerbeweging, the farmer citizen movement. And as Sean pointed out, there has been quite a bit of like aggressive extra parliamentarian action by farmers upset with nitrogen policy in particular. Good. Okay, so that climate policy I wanted to talk about. One issue that Catherine mentioned briefly, and that I do think has been much more salient over the past year in Dutch politics than really any time before, as an issue that really affects practically every party in the political spectrum, is that of sort of race, religion, and identity. And so we see there's a couple of new parties that I think are very active, sort of around that set of issues. And Catherine, maybe can you talk us through what's happened there? What how we've seen that discussion evolve really since the 1990s, I think, is when it started becoming a very salient part of Dutch politics.
Yeah. So I think in some ways the kind of at least identity and community aspects have of course already traditionally been in Dutch politics over the religious parties, so the small religious parties, and also morality issues, if you will, around abortion, around euthanasia, and so on. So what really happened in the late 1990s, and this comes back to what you actually also raised, Stan, that the environment issue was not discussed in the 2017 campaign, but then became total element of the government. That's a bit the Dutch way. So that's the other side of pragmatism, is depoliticizing because we need a coalition. And then all of a sudden the rabbit comes out of the hat, and then you can get, you can see pushback, societal pushback. And I think this was also very much the story that a very skillful entrepreneur, Pim Fortuyn, who started his own party, mobilized in the early 2000s. There had been anti-immigration parties or Dutch nationalist parties before, but they were a bit ostracized. Members would leave parliament when someone would speak. But then Pim Fortuyn really changed that. He skyrocketed himself in. Of course, unfortunately, he was not able to witness it himself because he was assassinated. He was actually assassinated by an animal rights activist, and many people forget that. So also gives you the indication of that issue has been on his stance on fur. Actually, he used a lot of fur and wore a lot of fur. And he was explicitly, Pim Fortuyn, anti-immigration and highlighting the concerns of political Islam, or radical Islam, as he would call it at that time. Now, I think with Wilders, a lot of the adjectives have left. It's just about Islam and Muslims in and of itself. Pim Fortuyn was actually, if you now look back to it, a much more intellectual approach to this, discussing problems of freedom of speech versus freedom of religion, discussing issues like gender rights and homosexual rights when you have minorities in the country that don't accept those rights. And that was a lot of the discussion. He wanted a general pardon of all immigrants into the country, so even illegally or illegally, but then stop migration in order to first have integration of these groups within Dutch society. And that then radicalized after many different waves. So what you often see with these challenger parties coming in, so then of course, because they lost their leader, Pim Fortuyn, it totally collapsed in the election after. And then you saw different parties trying to fill up that vacuum on the right, and then becoming more extreme, because you always, if you're a disruptor, you have to You have to Elon Musk, like you have to go more extreme to get attention, to be in the debate. So that's what you saw, and then ultimately that led into Forum for Democracy. And I think also on these exit polls, I just want to highlight that 7 seats going to Forum for Democracy, who is a denier of the coronavirus, who has been accused of anti-Semitism, and there have been actual messages throughout an app, which he of course downplays, of racist remarks, and he still gets 7 seats. I do think that's quite amazing in the Dutch system. So we've seen that coming in, and now we saw a little bit of this counter movement, especially Bijeen, which is what Stan already talked about, which is an anti-racism party, highlighting also a lot of diversity within Dutch society. I mean, the Netherlands has had black Dutch people in their midst for a very long time, and who have been marginalized in the debate. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That comes from the old colonies. There's not been a lot of discussion about the colonial history. Even our current Prime Minister or previous Prime Minister Rutte has downplayed a lot of that. Also the role of the Dutch in slavery and transporting of slaves, and has said things like, well, that's 150 years ago, that's not our responsibility, etc., these kind of things. So, and that really has led a bit to a pushback. And she, the leader of Bijeen, was a TV personality, very explicit on these issues, and also gained, I think, more in prominence on the Black Lives Matter protests, which were also in the Netherlands, and also some getting down of some statues of slave traders in some cities, smaller cities outside of Amsterdam. So I think that's a little bit the debate on that. And then you see also some of the other progressive parties that have highlighted that, D66, for example, as well, also on gender. But the kind of diversity issue has been quite explicit. And also another element is, especially Forum for Democratie, is a party, so Forum for Democracy, sorry, sometimes difficult to get the English term, is a party.
Well, some of the party names are close enough in Dutch.
Exactly, Forum for Democracy, we kind of understand.
Good way to test people.
But it's actually also a party that's quite anti-women and anti-gender, anti-transgender, etc. Right? So these elements, these things that you also see within the American system, you see in the British debate, are also part and parcel now of the Dutch debate.
Yeah, I think for our U.S. audience, I think thinking of the FVD as an extremely online alt-right party is actually not a bad way to
I think that's a correct description.
Is not a bad way to go about it. So now I promised Sean and his staffers that I would not ask him to put a coalition together, given that it's a different country's domestic politics. But now that we've imagined that this exit poll is close to true, Matt and Catherine, what do you think will happen?
So Tomian Mayus, I just saw, the NRC columnist, notes that if this is literally correct, you can do a 3-party coalition between VVD, CDA, and D66. The chances is literally collective, right? That's a 76-seat coalition, which is too narrow for comfort, and it's not going to. These polls aren't going to be accurate anyway. So they'll probably still need one more party. As you said, I think like D66 is not that comfortable going back into a coalition with CDA and not having anybody on any other leftist party on their side. And I just wonder, would they go to Volt, get a few extra seats in there on that's definitely another progressive pro-EU party, or can they? That
3-party coalition would also only have 27 or so seats in the Senate.
And exactly, that's what I was about to say. It will have a problem in the Senate.
Yeah, but that's going to be an issue regardless, in part because YA 21, which as we talked about, split off from the FVD, has kept most of the FVD's seats in the Senate. And so they have 8 senators out of 75, which throws everything into chaos. So I don't know. Obviously, so in the Netherlands, the Tweede Kamer, the second chamber, the lower chamber, is really the dominant chamber of the legislative branch, and so you could in principle govern with a Senate minority, but it's not ideal. And it does involve constant training. But anyway, so those three parties, the question is, would D66 want that? I think another question is, would the Christian Democrats want that now that they're down to 14 seats? They're becoming a pretty small party too, and I don't know that they want to take the risk of entering yet another governing coalition as a junior partner and then ending up where Labour is now. I think that for a party that prior to the Rutte coalition, the Rutte-led coalitions, was the largest party in the country, I think that's perhaps not a route they'd want to go, not a path they'd want to go down. As you said, you could add Volt. Volt, of course, is very pro-EU. It's a federalist. It supports a federal European government. I think that seems like it'd be hard to square with some of the VVD and the CDA's moves, and so I don't know. It's not. I don't think it's that easy, but we'll see.
I mean, I think it's also quite difficult, actually, this outcome. It's interesting that maybe if this really would end up being the outcome, if some of the later polls would have shown more for D66, it could have actually gotten closer to the VVD, because the VVD was going down because of its COVID bump. And I think a very important element also to highlight is even what kind of, I'll say what I think the coalition will be, but what will be important is that it's very likely that Rutte will not sit the 4 years, because there are still two big committees coming out on the benefit scandal, and they have to do with the discriminatory and perhaps gendered aspects of this. So of course, this was an algorithm that was used. There are many more people from migrant backgrounds, also women that of single parent households, usually by women, that are much more likely just by the numbers to be quote unquote fraudulent, because that was what you get out. Those are the people who are more likely to get benefits. So a lot of this came from an algorithm issue as well. So, and these things have been taken out by Rutte cleverly out of the previous committee, but will still come back on. So it's not even sure if Rutte will survive this entire period. Some people also thought that maybe he should have resigned and let someone else, but there was also not a clear number two. In the VVD.
And of course, ironically, the leader of the Labour Party, which was no longer a part of the government, did resign over this issue even before the government fell. One of the leaders of the eventual pushback against these practices, the number two of the Christian Democrats, who presumably may want to try and stage an intra-party coup. And some of these results, I mean, it's hard to imagine that the Green Left will, for example, keep its current leader after this loss. And so, we'll see a few weeks of turmoil. I think it's bad news for Sean, because it's hard to imagine that this result would lead to a new government within a week. And so,
But I do think also, I mean, maybe I'm too pragmatist on this, but you do see a lot of parties talking about that it cannot take too long. So just as you follow maybe also Belgian politics, the Belgians got yesterday a coalition after 541 days. So that was like also frowned upon a little bit, right? We want to do this fairly quickly, but I think this result is difficult. So on the CDA, what you said, so the person who kind of was crucial at uncovering this scandal, the benefit scandal, Pieter Omtzigt, number two of the CDA, he's also very clear that he wants more opposition. I think he might use this to kind of get his leadership within the CDA and move the CDA out of government, because that would be, but that puts I think this election result puts Rutte in a very difficult position. Because if you get a coalition with the Social Democrats, for example, which have said they want to go with Green Left, with D66, and then the VVD, that will be a very left-wing coalition for Rutte. And Rutte being weaker than he is now, with all the issues still coming on, it's not easy for the VVD, this one.
So we have there's a second exit poll that we will soon see the results of. It's a revised exit poll. Who knows what the political scientists do in between exit polls? But I think they may have added people who voted during the last half hour. Maybe try to see what happened with with our vote by mail experiment. This time was the first election during which voters over the age of 70 were allowed to vote by mail, in addition to overseas voters like myself, which are always allowed to vote by mail. And so those results are very similar to the ones we've seen already, and we're we'll update this slide shortly. So if you see the numbers change a little bit, the VVD got in that revised exit poll, the VVD will get 36 seats instead of 35. But the numbers are generally quite similar. The FVD gets 8 instead of 7. But so the overall dynamics won't change. Now, one thing that is for me hard, ultimately D66 is obviously going to have to be a part of this coalition, I would say, just because otherwise it's hard to imagine how you get to 275. Maybe you could experiment with a minority government along Scandinavian lines. That's not something that has happened very frequently in the Dutch system. Catherine, I don't know to what extent you have that comparative politics knowledge ready to go.
Yeah.
I believe you're the author of a textbook on European politics.
Yeah, exactly.
So I feel like I can draw on you for any and all questions along these lines.
So that's a really difference in the sense of with the Scandinavian countries, especially Denmark, right, where rules a lot by minority government and does that also and has this kind of political culture to do that. So I actually was one of the people together with Sarah de Lange, who was professor at the University of Amsterdam, that wrote on the previous minority government we got that they should just try that because of Denmark, but that it didn't go down very well, to be fair, because they had to support, of course, the CDA and the VVD, so the Liberal Party and the Christian Democratic Party, Conservative Liberal Party and the Christian Democratic Party of Wilders, and that turned out not to be very stable. I think, Stan, I would think at this time unlikely if I would be any campaign manager to try to do this, especially for the issue that you raised about the Senate, so that you would then be minority in both of the chambers, and that might turn out to be very difficult to govern, especially in a system where we don't have this culture of integrating opposition and don't have a strong committee culture, like, for example, in Denmark. So I think they will probably go even more for oversized. So not for those, that's what the Dutch usually do. So not for like 3 parties and then having an issue perhaps, but then taking on more parties and then hammering it out. The only thing is that, for example, Sigrid Kaag, so the leader of D66, has said that we should not do that. So we should not go and hammer out an entire deal for, like, let's say, 88 months and then do it, but actually do it on core issues, especially because the corona pandemic is so, unfolding still. So that would also be interesting. Are we going to see a complete contracting in a coalition accord, or are we going to see more room of movement because of the extraordinary conditions?
Well, lots of things to consider. We have about 4 minutes left, so I want to give everyone the opportunity to deliver closing remarks. Matt, I believe you were about to.
Well, I was just going to say, my understanding is that one of the issues with the very tight governing coalition agreements that they've had, where you hammer out every detail and every policy before you go into coalition together, is that because parties then, by the sort of etiquette of Dutch politics, aren't really allowed to complain about things that they've agreed to in those coalition agreements. It's extra devastating to go into a coalition as a minority party, because you spend 4 years sitting there with your constituents unhappy about compromises that you've made with other parties, and you can't even complain about them publicly. When Jesse Klaver, for example, is saying, we should just have some core agreements, and then the rest we can hammer out in Parliament between whichever parties want to strike an agreement there. It seems like that's part of what they're thinking about. But the other thing, I just was wondering whether you think, Catherine, that it seems like VVD is very reluctant to go into a coalition with Green Left. I don't know if that's based on their previous negotiating experience the last time around, or what's behind that. But do you think that's going to hold up, or are they going to have to cave and consider them as a coalition partner?
So I think that even if I was looking back a little bit today on also what Hoekstra said, but then because Rutte always says, I don't think it's very chic of me to say anything about coalitions. He's trying to be above all the parties. But I think that there's a lot of discussion that everything needs to be on the table. And I think that the only thing I think that I cannot see Jesse Klaver surviving this. Because he didn't have a stronghold in the party, and this is not a good result at all for the party. So that will be interesting to develop. I could see a kind of a patchwork of many different parties emerging, but to be fair, even though I believe in the pragmatism of going to get a government, this is not an easy result, and this is not an easy result for the VVD and for Rutte. And I think it illustrates a little bit maybe of what we're going to see, which is the end of the Rutte reign. Its question is going to be in 2 years or in 4 years, basically, and then who's going to be that, or even earlier that we see the series Borgen, which is the Danish series that even the minority, so that Sigrid Kaag could become a prime minister. Some female voters, I think, have had this idea that would be great to have a first female prime minister. But I think it's tricky for Rutte, but given the earnest situation, they can't take too long. And I think probably what they will do is indeed not to hammer out everything and do it on accords, and my prediction will be that there will be quite a lot of parties in this coalition.
Very good. Sean, any concluding thoughts before we sign out here? We have now on screen the second exit poll, which, as you can see, is fairly similar to the first one. Looks like the Christian Union was one of those junior coalition partners that didn't do so well. I think they'll be slightly disappointed. But otherwise, these results really seem to confirm what we saw before, 3 seats for Volt instead of 4. But I think they will still be quite happy with that, as they were polling at basically 0 a month and a half ago. So Sean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, from an outside observer standpoint, some very interesting things from our perspective is that last election was really about a lot of immigration and Nexit and Brexit, and then how quickly in 4 years everything changes, and the pandemic, which nobody expected, and looking at the issues this time and how different they are from last time, and the outcome as well. I mean, you really do have a strong showing for pro-EU parties. I think from the United States standpoint, that will make a government that we can work with, because I think the Biden administration has already signaled that they want to turn the corner with working with the EU and do things differently than the previous administration did. For the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, I think all of us have learned you should never underestimate Mark Rutte. I think those that have done so are long in political oblivion. So it'd be interesting to see what he comes up with. I do think that Catherine's entirely correct, and the ambassador mentioned at the beginning about the Dutch preference for the polder model and having everybody as many people as possible under the tent or in the house. And so I think they will look for a broader perspective, even if they could theoretically do it with 3 parties. That's a very small majority and would be difficult to hold for much more than a year, probably. So we hope that it won't take as long as last time, is all I can say. So, and my only final remark is I apologize to all my Dutch friends for not wearing orange, but it is March 17th. So in America, you've got to wear green.
I am in the safety of my home, so I put on some orange, but I understand that you had to go into the office and you would not want to be assaulted by people celebrating St. Patrick's Day. Good. Well, thank you all very much. With that, I think we're ready to conclude here. Thank you for tuning in. We should have final election results in a couple of hours, so I encourage you to stay up and see what happens. But with that, thank you. You'll be able to find the video on the event page in the very near future, in case you want to rewatch what we said today and what we got wrong. But thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.